What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Table Talks. This episode is the first of its kind because I think it's just going to be more so a discussion. I think a philosophical one to an extent, definitely a political one, maybe, or most definitely. A lot of different, themes to this discussion that we're about to have. And this discussion, what influenced me or what motivated me to make this specific episode, dedicating this theme to this episode, was something I heard the other day on the Joe Rogan Experience. Hey everyone, before we continue the segment, don't forget to subscribe, like, dislike, leave a positive comment, leave a negative comment. I don't care. Thanks for watching, and now on to the program. The guest that was speaking was Eric Weinstein. And if you know anything about Eric Weinstein, I won't get too much into detail about, who he is. You can, Google him if you'd like. Definitely, not someone to, or someone to, take the biggest grain of salt when, hearing him speak and stuff like that. Regardless, though, what he said on the Joe Rogan Experience, he said something along the lines of, he quote unquote, he goes after institutions. And that really stuck with me, for some time after, I heard it initially on the episode. And if one thing I will, mention about Eric Weinstein is that one thing that he, that is undoubtedly true is that he is essentially kind of, not, I don't want to say looked down upon by institutions per se, but to give an example as to why he said he goes after institutions is because like he'll get invited to a university and he'll get invited to speak, yet the people who are inviting him, to speak at the university, essentially tell him that he can't say that, that he's like, I don't know. There's this weird thing that goes on, and to whatever reason, because the I don't want to, talk about that specifically, his situation with, the issues he has with his institutions. What I want to get down and discuss is the duality between institutions and the individuals. What this whole video is based on, what the name of this video is based on, the institution versus the individual. Hearing Eric Weinstein say he goes after institutions because these institutions kind of, bar him from, I guess, expressing himself to the fullest extent, or, Eric Weinstein believes I will say he believes he has credit to what he does that other people just don't see or don't, otherwise credit him for. It's kind of, like if I, just, called myself something and, no one else around me really, knew me as that thing, I don't go around saying, like in my case specifically, like if I'm giving an example, I don't go around saying I'm a martial artist simply because I'm still, a very adolescent student in martial arts. Or another example is, I don't go around saying like I am, I have my like master's in economics if I like, maybe have only like read one economics book once, or maybe wrote an economics paper once. But regardless, the bottom line is that Eric Weinstein had mentioned that he goes after institutions, and the reason why he goes after institutions is because of the people at the institutions. Is, like I said, the the main example being, he gets invited to, speak at a department at, a university, and the people inviting him to that department tell him that he cannot say like, oh, I'm a physicist speaking at, this department at this university. He has to say like, he said that, I tell people I'm an entertainer. And, you go to his Wikipedia page, and the only things that they reference Eric as is a podcaster and an investor. And Eric, calls himself a mathematician, and I don't know if he necessarily refers to himself as a physicist, but it does say a lot about someone, when they refer to themselves as, one thing, when everyone else in the world refers to them as something else. And that's essentially why he said that he goes after institutions. And that just, that kind of triggered my thought process, because this is something that I've always, that is kind of, rooted into, who I am and what I argue for and what I believe should be kind of the driving force of how people argue with one another, people debate one another, people confront one another, how, law, how, the driving mechanisms of law, what the driving mechanisms of law should be, so on and so forth. And it's always been this duality of the institution versus the individual. And in this case, when we're, talking about the institution, the way I'm referring to it as, the institution is basically anything you subscribe yourself to, any sort of, any sort of, community you're in, any sort of culture you're in, whatever you're born into, essentially, because, disregarding our beliefs, disregarding, what, how certain people interpret, where certain institutions come from, like religious institutions per se, and how a lot of people argue that, the premise of, this argument, whether between, not this argument, but this duality between the institution and the individual, is that there is, some school of thought out there amongst many, schools, that there are institutions that came before individuals, basically being, the religious institutions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, all other ones too, per se. And, when I'm referencing, the institution, I'm referencing, like I said, anything that you are a part of. The institutions I'm a part of. I am, I'm an Arab, I'm an American, I'm a Muslim, I have, when I'm referring to institutions, I'll refer to the ones that you really can't, that are just man-made, essentially, that, when you can't, objectively say like, oh, these institutions came before individuals. Like, no, these institutions were, created by individuals. The languages we speak, the way we communicate with one another, that is all a part of, this evolution of humanity, essentially. How, we got to, names and nouns like, Arab and American and Muslim and, Christian, these terms, they were created by men, humans, essentially. Can't discredit the women, of course. But I'm going to type into Google real quick, because, this is supposed to be, mainly like a philosophical discussion. However, I think, doing a little bit of research, obviously, while I'm talking, will be beneficial to the episode. So I'm going to type into Google real quick, just something kind of that initially came up to my mind. Are there any institutions that came before man. Let's just go with that. No human-made or human-defined institution such as government, religion, or law predates mankind, as these are uniquely human creations. That's what, the AI overview is saying on Google, which, has always been the foundation of, where I go, or not where I go, but like how I approach arguing, or how I approach confrontation, or how I approach, anything. You can't simply go after institutions, is my, main argument, because institutions are comprised of both good and bad people. The main thing that I've always argued, that I've always stood by, that I know for a fact is universally true, is that good and bad are everywhere, and good and bad are within everyone. There are good and bad Arabs. There are good and bad Muslims. There are good and bad Christians. There are good and bad Jews. There are good and bad blacks. There are good and, the list goes on and on and on and on. And for everything, anywhere, for everyone at any point in history, it does not matter. All right. And it's when you come to realize this, you start to liberate yourself out of, thoughts that you didn't even know, made you confined, or put you in a box, or maybe made you think narrow-minded. One of the biggest thing that, when it comes down to this specific topic for me is for those of you that don't know, my parents are Palestinian, and I have grown up with this huge thing over me that is, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And one of the things that I come to realize is, for my belief, and I believe that, this rooted back to, you cannot just, say institutions are, I'm going to go after institutions and whatnot, essentially alluding to, like, oh, I'm on the right side, you're on the wrong side, all these people are bad, all these people are good, is I'm surrounded by, obviously, people who, think that, people who consider themselves Zionists are, like, terrible people. And I'm over here thinking, like, okay, then what happens when you meet, a Zionist or a group of Zionists who, who advocate for, go, like, because, real quick, let me just make sure I get the term correct. Zionism is a nationalistic and political movement that emerged in the late 19th century Europe, advocating for the reestablishment, development, and protection of the Jewish nation-state in the historical region of Palestine. Okay, disregarding, that term Zionist, what if you clearly have a percentage of people who are Jewish who, believe that, they, have the right to return and whatnot, and also who believe that, they can live amongst the people that they are constantly fed, are trying to, kill them, or, harm them, or are constantly, in conflict with them, going back to the whole Palestinian-Israeli conflict. One thing I believe is that I believe that all conflicts are manufactured by the establishments. It does not matter, who it is. I firmly believe that, the establishment, within the Palestinian territories, are just as guilty of doing just as terrible things that have prevented, peace and prosperity within that land, as much as the Israeli government has. I'm not going to get into that, conversation at all right now. The main point I'm getting at is, you just have to strip these terms, and get down to the fundamental of realizing that there are good and bad Zionists. It's that's a fact. That is a fact. There are people out there who are Jewish who want to live in Israel, that also would allow had no problem with having Arab Muslims, Palestinians live amongst them. That's a fact. That is inarguable. And same thing vice versa too. Good and bad Palestinians. There are plenty of Arabs and Palestinians and Muslims that are insufferable, and that truly are the rot of my side. And one thing that truly is liberating coming from this conversation of the institution versus the individual is that one of the most liberating things an individual can do for themselves is call out the rot within their own camp. And I firmly believe that if you cannot call out the rot within your own camp, then you have no right calling out the rot in any sort of opposition. And have your beliefs, okay? It's not to say that you can't stand for whatever you stand for. Obviously, it goes back to that saying, if you don't stand for anything, you'll fall for everything. But it goes back to knowing the line between shoving your beliefs down everyone else's throat and just keeping them to yourselves. Like, at the end of the day, what sort of benefit does anyone have when it comes to shoving your beliefs down other people's throats? I get in squabbles online all the time with individuals who are just rotten. And I think sorry, I just lost my train of thought. And obviously, getting into squabbles online is, toxic in general. But I do, believe that there is, because that's where, majority of, discourse is at now, is online. Regardless if you, know the person that you're engaging with might be, botted or an actual individual. But regardless, the liberating thing is God damn it, I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry, folks. But like I said, individuals, that's who, and it goes to the the discussion of how media talks about stuff. Media loves to use stats to their fullest extent, and not to the fullest extent, but to the extent to where they are using language regarding statistics to try and that sort of gives the viewers this sort of thing that goes on in their head, that when they see the news referencing statistics regarding something, it's like the next day when they see an individual that they don't even know may fall under the statistics, and they may do something terrible to that individual. Just like, for example, like let's give a hypothetical, like just like maybe you hear a news story about two Arabs doing something terrible here in the States, and it gets terms like terrorism gets brought up. The labels that these two individuals themselves, the institutions that they fall under, are going to get a lot more coverage than those two individuals would, as them being the individuals, which is, it's a tactic that the media uses for sure, to stir up, to scramble people's brains into, start behaving in the sense where they, think that, oh, all people here are like this, all people here are like that, and it's just wrong. It's just completely wrong. And new media, independent media, has the biggest responsibility, in my opinion, when it comes to reporting that you use the correct language when it comes to talking about certain things. You call out individuals who are doing the wrong things. You don't call out entire institutions and say that, oh, all people here are, doing this, or all people that are a part of this institution are essentially doing wrong, because even, the institutions that people might view as the most corrupt still have good people in them. That's a fact. And the institutions that, people deem as some of the best and brightest institutions have some of the most rotten individuals. That's a fact. And I mean, it's common sense. And I truly, I truly do blame the media for having, such a vile way of expressing news and important information to the masses, to the point where the masses, now have this view on, life, where everything is based off of the institutions. The names and the labels and the subjugations that we all put ourselves in, versus us just being, who we are individually. And yeah, I mean, it just, yeah, it's, and, sorry for not, speaking to the best extent. I didn't really, I don't really prepare for this stuff. I kind of just, wing it like that. Hopefully I've been making sense in my, language, and, how I've been explaining things. Hopefully you all can hear me well too. But anyways, yeah, don't go after institutions, because you very well will come across people one day who, are a part of the institutions that you had, thoughts about, that may, harm people in a sense, because, you're thinking some type of way, and, you come, and then you meet someone who, and it makes me, think about, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, of course, and, it's just like, I see, so much conversation online these days, obviously, about, the state of Europe, and, people saying it's being invaded by Islamism, and, Sharia law will be taking over and whatnot, so on and so forth. And obviously this is yet another tactic by the media to create, distress, chaos, panic amongst the masses, and, thinking they have something to worry about that is absolutely nothing at all. I go about my daily life here in the Midwest of the United States, and I've never felt the ways that the media has made certain things feel, in the sense of, oh, like, this is going on here, all of Europe is experiencing this, blah blah blah. And it's like, dude, like, again, using the language that, it's like, you're just being so, like just, I don't even know, what the term is, vague, nuanced, subtle. It's just, it's ridiculous. Like, it's and this is definitely a contribution of the downfall of, good discourse anywhere in the world, basically, is like, media, old media per se, or whatever, big media essentially has caused the average person to, have an attention span of a squirrel, basically, and only, have the ability to just, read headlines, and that's it, not read articles. That's part of the reason why part of Table Talks is breaking down articles, reading them full through, so you not only those who are, taking in my content can have a good understanding, but me as well. I need to know things too, to the fullest extent. I don't just, half-ass my work. I don't just, do something and, only put half the effort in. Like, you need to know it all. Like, not in the sense of knowing it all and like being a know-it-all, but like, if you are going to talk about something, you better back it up to the best extent. Have your primary and secondary resources. Have the ability to, come up with a thesis, that's driven by a good argument that can, bring it. Sorry, having a brain scramble. Going back to the main topic, institution versus the individual. Like I said, bottom line, you cannot talk about, institutions without realizing that it's individuals who are, making all the decisions in the sense. Whatever sort of, whatever reason you are mad at this institution or that institution is because someone made you mad. Or maybe you have, these misplaced thoughts, or maybe your ego's too big. I don't know. Because at the end of the day, when we all pass, are these institutions coming with us? Are these labels coming with us? I have a very hard time taking in the amount of, content and news that I take in on a weekly basis, and just, not only the people that I disagree with, but the people that I agree with, and just, and obviously, maybe I'm just, spending too much time online. That's definitely a thing. This is definitely, as much as I, am online and, producing all the content that I'm producing, definitely very important to just, step away from technology from time to time as much as possible. Don't be on your phone. Don't look at the screen. Majority of us are looking at a screen for our, our income, our main income, and then we're looking at a screen for our main entertainment. And it's like we're spending, 2/3 of our days on screens, and that's not, not only killing our eyesight, it's rotting our brains. And yeah, so yeah, I don't really know where else to go with this. I'm sure people have, certain opinions on certain things regarding, if institutions did come before man, simply because, they are religious institutions that were given to us by God himself. And, that's fine and dandy to believe, but the moment, that belief starts getting shoved down other people's throats is the moment where, conflict will arise and will stay here forever, because that's essentially, why certain things happen in the world, is because certain people want to shove their beliefs down other people's throats, and if those people do not comply, then they get murdered or something along those lines. Rape, torture, killed, I don't know. Yeah, terrible things happen to not terrible people. Terrible things happen to good people everywhere. It doesn't matter. If you can't admit, atrocities happening to, the underdogs somewhere in the world, or, the underprivileged in whatever part of the world, then you really cannot comment on what is best for humanity. There are, people that I, see online, that I come across on a daily basis, who just don't appear to have a soul. Like they're the lack of empathy, the lack of sympathy. I cannot imagine, and when I was talking to, Terry Grundy, friend of the show, Professor Terry Grundy, shout out to Terry Grundy. And I mentioned this in our podcast episode we did recently, the first one we did, that, the biggest fear I have is waking up tomorrow and being someone that I'm, not the person that I'm today, and waking up and being someone totally different. And it's like, that is one thing I fear, is, like waking up tomorrow and I have this mindset now that just, is just nothing but rot. I hope I never wake up and have like a rotted mindset like that, because I just, yeah. But anyways, we'll end the discussion there for now. This probably, I don't know how long this was. But yeah, no, I will definitely want to bring up more of these sort of conversations for table talks, just, philosophical discussion with many different themes behind them. This first one that I'm doing, obviously the institution versus the individual, understanding that, when you just sound so bigoted when you say, oh, all Jews are like this, all Muslims are like this, Islam is, terrible, or, Judaism is bad. And I'm using these two examples because this is the most controversial topic that has, been at the forefront of basically, a lot of arguments here on earth, that arguably, I mean, regardless of, the belief that I have that everything is connected, this topic regarding, the Abrahamic religions and the conflicts in the Middle East, I think, directly connect to all parts of the world. It does not matter. I mean, people argue that that's like in the Levant is where the birth of, humanity, came from. So when you have, this, this bittersweet thing that's extremely heavy over you, it's hard to not use it as an example of, talking about, the institution versus, the individual, because like I said, there are good and bad people within my camp. There are good and bad people within the opposition's camp. There are good and bad Arabs, good and bad Jews, good and bad Israelis, good and bad Muslims, good and bad everywhere. It does not matter. And, it just, there's a quote from, Harry Potter that I think Sirius Black says it. It's, there are good and bad, good and bad are within everyone, and it's, just a matter of what you act on, though it's those two, it's the two decisions in life, that you're going to, the decisions you make in life essentially have two different outcomes, and the consequences are either going to be good or bad for you, regardless. Like, it doesn't matter what you do. You wake up tomorrow, oh, I decide I'm not going to go to work. That's great for you in this moment. It's going to be bad for you in another moment. Bad for you for whatever company you work for, because, you decided that you were going to, stay home and not go to work and not do, what the company is expecting you to do. So, whatever. And, you decide to, buy this, you spend money. That's, bad. You have the thing that's good. That's life. The duality, the tooth, the balance of life is, not to get on this rant, but, I believe, and I'm, sure, really can't be argued, there's three universal laws within, humans, all humans that have ever lived, that are currently living, that will live, and that is, life and death. We all live, we're all born, we're all gonna die, doesn't matter. Good and bad, and everyone, it doesn't matter, how depressed you are, you're gonna, experience a moment in time that, is gonna make you feel good. It doesn't matter if you are the most privileged individual, you're gonna deal with, some BS every now and then. It doesn't matter. Everyone deals with hardship, everyone deals, has a good time. And then the third thing is, there's yourself, the individual, and then there's the world around you, and that, you don't owe anything to the world, and the world doesn't owe anything to you. And with that being said, creates this, this phenomena, this, complex within life here on earth that, I can go about my day and, not care about anyone, not, give empathy or sympathy to anything, and just do whatever I want, and not, give a thought about what the consequences are. The world doesn't owe me anything. I can, go rob a bank. I can go, do this, do that. And, but obviously there are consequences. There are laws. We don't, we live in this world. This is the reality here. I can't just, think that, this world is mine and I can do whatever. And, vice versa, talking about, being a good person, doing the good things. You do the good things because, it's good, and it, makes you feel good, and you shouldn't expect things in return, because the world doesn't owe you anything. And it's nice when the world gives you things, because when the world gives you things, it's not the world owing you something because you did something good, or that you are waiting for something good to happen in your life. Like, no, like, good things are going to happen to you regardless, and bad things are going to happen to you regardless. And this goes into the topic of something else that I it's always on my mind, that's rooted in my the thought process that I have, the who I am as a person, is that this idea in regards to good and bad. And it's just very this thing that goes on within societies around the world. When good things happen to people want to think that all the good things that happen to me, I make happen, or it's when good things happen to me and they're unexpected, it's amazing, it's a blessing, whatever. And then when the bad things happen, people automatically default to this mindset, like, why did this happen to me? Religious people default to saying stuff like, God, why did you do this? Blah blah blah. And it's this it's the duality, the dynamic between free will and determinism, and how basically the two decisions you make in life come down to free will and determinism working hand in hand. Your life, I am a firm believer in life being planned out for you as it goes, regardless if if I was brought up as a Muslim or in any sort of religious household, because Christians and Jews and I'm sure there is a thought process amongst most schools of thought that your life is planned out, God has your life planned out, so on and so forth. Things happen for a reason, there's no such things as accidents, blah blah blah. And then the concept of the decisions you make were made by you, that I made these decisions. And because it is this conversation can definitely be had in another episode, but like I said, the concept that the decisions you make in life come at a sort of two-way street sort of mentality, that there's no third, fourth, fifth option. There's always just going to be, you did this, these are the consequences, and they're either going to be good and bad, rooted also in free will and determinism. Both those are working hand in hand. You have the ability to choose what's going to happen, but what's going to happen is already predetermined. Not that all the decision you made was already predetermined. It's that the consequences of those decisions were already going to happen regardless. The domino effect. It's and regardless of how many sort of routes you can take with that decision making, the consequences are still going to happen regardless. That's the main reality, is that there's it's not that life is planned out, it's that the consequences are already set in stone regardless. Physics and whatnot, the action and reaction, like there's no sort of Tenet, that sort of radiation in that movie Tenet that causes the time to move backwards or whatever. It's no, there's only this sort of forward, the dimension that we are in, you know, causes that we only know. Moving forward in time, you know, I don't think anyone at any point in life has ever been able to peek into the fourth dimension, which is, you know, looking at, you know, the entire lifespan of, you know, whatever you're looking at. Regardless, though, you know, didn't mean to go off on a tangent, but, you know, like I said, I'll end it right there. I know I mentioned that 10 minutes ago, but hopefully this was, you know, a good conversation. Hopefully you guys, you know, took something away from this. Hopefully you guys were inspired to just start calling out the individuals around you and let the individuals be who they are as individuals, and don't take the, you know, them as being, you know, the main arbiters of the institutions that they're in. Just because some Arab does something terrible doesn't mean that all Arabs are terrible. And that's it, folks. Have a good night. Keep you up to date on things. Just, you know, connect with me on LinkedIn. More episodes to come. Have a good night. Hey everyone, thanks again for watching. It means a lot. Don't forget again to subscribe, like, dislike, leave a positive comment, leave a negative comment. I don't care. Thanks again for watching. We'll catch you next time.